So good morning again, and thanks for everyone dialing in this morning, or at least this morning for those of us on the East Coast for a few more minutes. So Kelly's already introduced the subject. I'd like to talk about joint confidence levels, and which is a new initiative in NASA, and that's been going on for several years. This is actually sort of a chartered talk at the 2014 NASA Cost Analysis Symposium. NASA headquarters asked me to make a talk on some subject, and I interpreted it to be this subject, so it seemed to be. So I'm going to do this in a little bit of an unusual approach here. I'm going to use some literary devices, 3 foils, and if you don't know what a foil is, if you've forgotten your English lit, don't worry, I'll tell you in just a few minutes. I'm going to use 3 foils, one called the Village Watchman Syndrome, one called the Lake Wobegon Effect, and one called the Best of All Possible Worlds. And then we'll talk about why view the world probabilistically to begin with. What's the difference between risk and uncertainty? How's risk analysis in NASA being done these days? And how can we interpret this thing called JCL that we've done? Okay, let's go to the next chart. All right, I don't know how many of you have worked with NASA or in the aerospace industry, but we've got our own jargon. Each industry does, of course. So here's a little decoder ring for several phrases I'll be using, NASA speak phrases today, so to make sure everybody halfway understands what I'm talking about, let's go through this very quickly. JCL is an acronym for Joint Confidence Level, which is really shorthand itself for a joint probability distribution of a project's cost and schedule, okay? You can have conditional probability distributions, you can have marginal probability distributions, but we're going to be talking about a joint probability distribution, which is really the probability that the cost of the schedule will be X, cost of the project will be X, and the schedule will be Y jointly. It's obtained by doing a Monte Carlo simulation using something called a cost-informed schedule, and cost-informed is NASA speak itself for a cost-loaded integrated management schedule. I think most schedule people use the term cost-loaded. Lots of times in NASA we use cost-informed. Cont'd is another acronym you may see here in the presentation, and it stands for Cost Analysis Data Requirement. And all NASA projects are required to produce one of those things at their major milestones, at SRR, PDR, CDR, launch, and end of mission. So these Cont'ds are snapshots of the project at each milestone. It records the project's technical description and its cost. And those are the artifacts from which NASA draws information on the health of its projects, as well as historical information for building new cost models and new tools. Another thing that's not unique to NASA is the 5x5 risk analysis approach. That's fairly common, but NASA just routinely refers to it as the 5x5, but what they really mean is a risk matrix which tries to communicate the probability and the severity of severity of impact of a given risk. New start is another term that NASA uses, and that just means the congressional authority to start a new project. So some of those terms will be recurring in this talk. Okay, let's go to the next chart. Okay, so I told you I was going to use this thing called a foil, and you're scratching your head. What is a foil, some of you? So the hero of our story is this thing called JCL, Joint Confidence Level, okay? But in literature, a foil is a character who the author contrasts with the hero in order to highlight some particular qualities of the hero. So in this case, in this talk today, I'll be using 3 foils to draw attention to some of the things about JCL that I want to bring to light. The word foil, incidentally, is where it comes from. It's in the little box at the bottom of the chart. It comes from the old practice of backing gems with foil to make them more shiny, okay? So we'll be trying to shine up JCL here a little bit by comparing it to some things. Okay, let's go to chart 5. Okay, so what's our first foil? Our first foil is something called the Village Watchman Syndrome. Now, this actually is something that those of you in the cost analysis discipline, I'm assuming many of you on the call today are working in that discipline. We're real fond of this little story from this British civil servant back in 1929, Josiah Stamp. And he says the government are very keen on amassing statistics. They collect them, add them, raise them to the nth power, then take the cube root. I love that part. And prepare wonderful diagrams. But you must never forget that in the first instance, the data comes down from the village watchman, who pretty much just writes down what he damn well pleases, okay? So the point here is that maybe our common belief that very detailed cost and schedule estimates provide more accuracy might be a little suspect if the data that we are using to do the cost and schedule estimates might have some noise in it itself. JCL is extremely detailed as it's being practiced in NASA, and we have this tendency to say, oh, let's go to deeper and deeper levels of detail, and that'll give us more accuracy. Which our foil here would say is not obviously the truth each time. So JCL does use a logically linked IMS. It can theoretically use the entire schedule of the project, depending on how many tasks are in a schedule. But most NASA projects, by the time they get to PDR, certainly by CDR, have thousands of tasks in the integrated management schedule. So working at that level is usually not practical, and so we usually come up with a summary version of that IMS to do the JCL. It may have a few hundred elements in it as opposed to a few thousand. So what do we do once we get that summary IMS? Well, we have a cost estimate that somebody else probably produced using probably parametrics or analogies or even detailed bill of materials and labor estimates. And we try to take that cost and slice it and dice it and hang it on the framework of the IMS. That's kind of the way JCL has to run, and we'll talk more about that as we proceed here. So our Village Watchman poll might suggest to some of us that to the extent that we work at such levels of detail, we could be fooling ourselves about accuracy, okay? So I think it's important to keep that in mind. So that's the first foil. Let's go to chart 6. The second one is the Lake Wobegon effect. So Lake Wobegon is a fictional town in an NPR radio show that some of you might be familiar with. Garrison Keillor is the Prairie Home Companion. And in this mythical place, all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. So NASA project managers, and I've worked with hundreds of them over the years, I would say that some very high percentage of them, 95% or more, firmly believe that they and their projects hail from Lake Wobegon. They believe that they will outperform the norm, okay? So our Lake Wobegon foil suggests that NASA project teams can't all be above average, okay? That's statistically impossible. On a side here, just for a moment, though, it's not all bad that our project managers and their teams are optimists, okay? We really want them to be optimists. We want them to believe in their heart that they can do something that nobody else has done before and do it better. I mean, that's actually a good thing, but we also have to guard against their undue optimism, unbounded optimism. Okay, let's go to chart 7. Our third and final foil is this guy named Gottfried Leibniz. He was a German philosopher. Back in the 1700s, Gottfried was sitting around worrying about something. And what he was worrying about is, this world we live in. How can injustice and evil coexist with a all-powerful, omnipotent, and benevolent God? Why can't God, cause suffering and injustice to go away? He coined this phrase, the best of all possible worlds, after thinking about it a while. And by the way, it's also a pretty cool song by Chris Christopherson. But anyway, back to Leibniz. Leibniz reasoned that God, in order to avoid a clockwork world where everything just happened automatically, he had to give humans free will. So the moment God did that, the world necessarily has suffering and injustice and evil in it. So Leibniz mulled this over and he thought, well, this is really a suboptimal solution. I really don't like it. But you know what? It's probably the best we can do. It's the best of all possible worlds. So that's where that phrase comes from. Okay, similarly, the World NASA Cost Analysis before JCL may have already been the best of all possible worlds. So maybe we're not improving it with JCL, I'm suggesting here. And why am I saying that? Because any movement toward better cost analysis moves us in the direction of fewer new starts. New starts are what fuels the engine of NASA and many government and private industries as well, being able to start new projects. So said another way, good cost analysis can also kind of be birth control for projects, okay? And what I mean by that is that if you have good cost analysis and you accurately estimate the cost and schedule, I should be saying cost and schedule analysis, and as you accurately estimate the resources in terms of cost and schedule, maybe it's going to take more of your new start budget than you had hoped, and therefore you can start fewer projects. And NASA, as I've already said, lives and dies on new starts. So our best of all possible world foil here suggests that JCL is just another fad, okay, that's being used to portray a new approach that will yield more accurate cost and schedule estimates when, in fact, we really don't want good cost and schedule estimates, because if we did know what this project is going to cost and how long it's going to take, we couldn't embark upon it because we don't have enough money in our out-year budget to do it. Okay, so let's go to the next chart. Let's go to chart. Thank you. Okay, so that ends the English Lit 101 part. Sad to say, no, I'm just kidding. So we've introduced three foils. The first one, the village watchman syndrome, that says working at lower levels of detail might not provide accuracy. The Lake Wobegon effect, where project managers and their teams regress towards the mean. Okay, but they don't know that. They think they can beat the odds and perform better than the mean result consistently. And the final one is the best of all possible worlds philosophy, which says that JCL is just another fad. It really won't change anything. Cost and schedule growth will continue because that's the only way to sell projects. Okay, with that background, let's launch into the main part of this talk, starting with chart 9. Okay, we'll go on to chart 10. Okay, so let's just pause for a second and think about something. Why should we even view the world probabilistically? Well, let's say you commute to work, okay? Assume you do. Let's assume you do. So you drive X miles one way. That's really a deterministic variable, assuming you drive the same way every day. So X is the same value each and every day, within a certain error band, a very small error band. However, the time it takes you to drive may vary wildly, from Y sub 1 to Y sub 2 minutes, depending on all kinds of things, weather, traffic, that sort of thing. And so Y takes on a different value each day, and it's what we call a random variable. So there's two types of models that I'm going to talk about here today in this construct today. Deterministic models, which only use deterministic variables, and probabilistic models, or also stochastic models, which take into account the fact that, hey, some of this stuff that we use to model cost and schedule is really a range. It can take on a range of variables. It can be from some minimum up to some maximum, and it may even follow some probability distribution. Now, by the way, just by the way, just because we're using stochastic models doesn't say we still can't have some deterministic variables in there. You certainly can. There's some things that we think are not going to change very much at all, and it's fine to have those variables in there as a deterministic value. But those that we think might have a probabilistic range, we should model really as probabilistic distributions. Okay, next chart. Okay, so those of you who took probability and statistics at one or more times in your life, one of the favorite tools in probability and statistics is a dice roll. Okay, it's always used to make some points about probability. So is the roll of dice deterministic or probabilistic? Well, it's not really probabilistic. The dice are obeying the laws of physics. And if we were sufficiently talented in statics and dynamics, which I took back in 1968, by the way, we could actually just ascertain the outcome of the roll of dice using physics calculations. Okay. So in that sense, it's not probabilistic. A roll of dice is really deterministic. It's following the laws of physics. It only appears probabilistic because I only had a B- in statics and dynamics in 1968, and I'm not capable of solving the physics equations. But project management, however, writ large, hopefully doesn't really involve physics calculations. Instead, project management requires an understanding of the task to do this project and the interrelated aspects of those tasks, and the cost and the schedule resources needed to accomplish things. Now, as the asterisk says, project management, those of you who are project managers are saying, wait a minute, it involves more than that. And yes, it certainly does, a lot more than that. But for our purposes here today, we're just going to talk about understanding tasks and their interrelationships and the cost and schedule associated with those tasks. So therefore, it's useful to, even though maybe some of this stuff is not probabilistic, or we don't know what the probability distribution is, it's still useful to model a project probabilistically, as we'll talk about more as we proceed here on chart 12. Okay, so what are the sources of uncertainty? Why are these things probabilistic? Well, it's noise in the historical data used to build the models. That's kind of back to the village watchman syndrome. And it's also uncertainty in the inputs, and on the input side. So our tools are uncertain. They've got statistical noise in them. And our inputs to the cost and schedule process are also uncertain. They can have optimism bias, and one of the more prevalent examples of that in NASA, at least, is in the technology readiness levels and in the heritage assumptions and in the team expertise. We always believe we believe our technology readiness level is greater than what it probably is. We believe we're going to make use of heritage from previous projects, and we will to some extent, but use it to a lesser extent than we forecast. and we believe our teams are from Lake Wobegon, so that they're going to perform well above average. So those are kind of the sources of uncertainty in a way, at least in one construct. Let's go on to the next chart and examine this a little bit more.
You're traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind, a journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. That's the signpost up ahead, your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Okay, so we're in the twilight zone now a little bit when we talk about risk and uncertainty. Now, somewhere along the way, by the way, I hope there's some fans of the Twilight Zone that got that music. Maybe most of you heard that before or seen the show. Somewhere along the way, I picked up a degree in economics, and if you do that, you have to study some things. But one of the things that is required is a guy named Frank H. Knight. He established the economic definition back in 1921, a landmark definition of risk, uncertainty, and profit. And by the way, just another aside, what he was actually worried about is in a capitalistic society where you have a bunch of firms competing against each other, how come that doesn't drive profit down to zero? I'm making a product, and then some guy across town is making the same product, and so I've got to lower my price in order to sell more. Then he lowers his price, and then everybody else, all the other manufacturers do the same thing. And after all that settles out, you're down to a zero profit level in the economy. Well, obviously that's not the way the economy works. People in very competitive industries are making money. So Knight wanted to think about that. That was his treatise that he wanted to think about that. So he wrote this book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, back in 1921. In there he defined risk, which has since become known as Knightian risk, or also it's called objective risk by economists. That's present when future events occur with some kind of measurable probability, like the roll of dice. We know the outcome is going to be 1 of 12 numbers with a probability of 1/12 for each one of those numbers. So that's a risk, but Knight said that's a risk, but we don't want to call that uncertain. That's obviously a risk, not uncertainty. So an uncertainty, Knight said, which has become called Knightian uncertainty in economics, or subjective uncertainty. That's present when the likelihood of future events is really not known or is very difficult to calculate. And so one example might be the 2009 recession. Investors realized that Knightian uncertainty was loose upon the land, and they panicked, and they got their money out of most things except government securities market, or low-risk instruments. So that's an example of uncertainty, Knight would say. All right, let's think about this a little more. Let's go on to chart 15. Okay, so today it's evolved a little bit. Most academic sources parse risk and uncertainty, parse those two concepts, so much like what I've got here. Risk is when we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know what the probability distribution looks like. And uncertainty is also when we don't really know what's going to happen, and we don't know the distribution either. Now, that was kind of the prevalent view maybe post-Knight, immediately post-Knight, but let's inch toward a little bit more modern view, but still dated. And that's the one that risk is a loss or undesired outcome, and uncertainty is having too many unknown variables, which doesn't allow us to even estimate what's going to happen. But as we shall see here in a minute, that's even evolved a little bit, certainly in NASA, and I'm sure in other industries as well. The uncertainty definition in the previous sub-bullet isn't quite the current NASA project management view. So we're going to chip away a little bit here at Knightian uncertainty. So let's go to chart 16 and begin that chipping. Okay, so NASA's okay with the risk. With risk is the probability that an unfavorable event is going to happen. That's fine. And while NASA is okay with the understanding of uncertainty as the indefiniteness about the outcome of some situation, NASA believes that this uncertainty can be estimated or quantitatively dealt with, okay? And that's what's new on the landscape over the past 5 or 10 years. Initially, incidentally, NASA's in pretty good company. There's a book out there, a couple of books actually, for this guy named Douglas Hubbard. They're pretty popular right now. The first one I'll cite here is How to Measure Anything, and I think I've got the title at the bottom of the chart. So Douglas Hubbard argues pretty much exactly the way NASA has been arguing the past 5 or 10 years, to believe that they can deal with this uncertainty in a quantitative manner. And so why do they believe that? Well, it's this thing called Monte Carlo simulation, which came about in 1946, but it's been applied to project management now and cost estimating and schedule analysis in the last decade more and more. And I actually believe that if Knight were still alive, he'd probably say, oh, yeah, you know what, I think I agree that this Monte Carlo simulation can let us get at this certainty better than we have in the past. Chart 12. So let's zero in a little bit and talk about more specifically NASA's JCL process. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, I'll try to summarize it here on one chart. First of all, a summarized version of the project management schedule is normally used, as I've already mentioned. They call it the analysis schedule. And the first step usually is to do some health checks on that schedule to make sure that the darn thing actually makes sense, that you don't have a lot of open loop things or logic flaws and things of that nature. There's several nice little software packages out there, several guides by GAO and others that are very useful in debugging the logic flaws of schedules. So once that's done, the second step is to take a look at the durations of the task, but specify them as probability distributions now for those that we think do have some noise in them. So now we've got to come up with a range for our schedule durations. Everything, you know, something takes 8 months, okay, that's the most likely value, but how quickly could it be done? Well, maybe 6 months. Well, what if the normal amount of problems arose? How long would it take? Well, perhaps 10 months. So the third step is to map cost into this analysis schedule that we just put probability distributions on the schedule durations. Let's now map cost in there, and let's do that probabilistically as well. But not only do we have to come up with ranges of the cost, low, most likely, and high is the way it's generally done. A lot of triangle distributions are used, but that's not the only thing that's used. But anyway, another complication is we've got to separate cost into time-dependent and time-dependent and time-independent costs. Sometimes they're called fixed and variable costs. But a time-dependent cost is a cost that will grow larger if the schedule slips. There's some things that are not tied to the schedule. It's going to cost X dollars, and if the project slips, it's still going to cost X dollars. So we call those time-independent costs. The fourth thing we've got to deal with is the project's risk register. Now, risk register, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, is a list of the cost and schedule impacts, and we've got to map that list to the schedule and do that probabilistically as well. And that's the way NASA typically does that is they take the 5 by 5 that we've already talked about, and they convert the quantitative stuff that's in the 5 by 5 statements like such and such a risk has a likelihood rating of 3. Let's say 3. Let's all agree that that's going to be 40%, okay, and 40% probability of occurrence, and a schedule consequence of 4. Well, let's agree that equals 6 months. So sometimes it's sort of arbitrary how we do this conversion from the 5 by 5 into something that the JCL can ingest. We'll come back to that. So then after we've done all that stuff, we're finally ready to turn the crank on this gigantic machine, and we do typically Monte Carlo simulation is the way to do this. I suppose it could be done mathematically, but I think Monte Carlo simulation is mature enough and easy enough that that's the way it's mostly done. So we do that, and in the case of JCL, we try to come up with a bivariate distribution of cost and schedule, the joint confidence level. And from that, we can we have a bunch of cost and schedule pairs, and we can say, well, how many of those cost and schedule pairs are below some probability? Let's say NASA has a policy of trying to get to 70% joint confidence level. So how many of those simulations result in a cost and schedule pair that's below some threshold? And we can map that to the probability of achieving the project given a certain budget and a certain time. Okay, let's go to the next chart. So let's talk about some of the problems here of this. The first one comes to mind is the risk registers. The risk register is a term used with projects in NASA at least to describe a kind of central repository where everybody's working on the projects log in the risks that they come up with. So each risk includes information such as the probability, the impact, the countermeasures, who owns risk, and that sort of thing. Here's some examples of typical items on NASA risk registers. I mean, these are literally took these off, some half a dozen charts, half a dozen projects that I have worked on recently. So it's things like, hey, the instrument mass may exceed the bus capability. Somebody worry about that. Instrument power, that also may exceed our capability. Launch vibration and acoustics and environmental impacts during launch may exceed the limits of the spacecraft. Flight software might be late. Of course, that one never happens. I don't know why that's on this, but it is on this list. Software integration, it could be complex. We could have a shortage of skills. You could read down the rest of those for yourself. So those are literally right off the risk registers of typical NASA projects. So let's go to chart 19, please. Okay, so let's poke our hero, JCL, just a little bit with a stick, or you can call this constructive criticism if you like, but let's think about this risk register. Does it include the real risk? Well, as I gazed down that list that was on the previous chart, more often than not, the things I see on risk registers in NASA at least, it seems more like a list of the known engineering challenges that the engineers are actually gleefully looking forward to working on. They want to get those things in the risk register so that everybody can see how great they are at working those risks and defeating them. So are these risks on the risk register on that previous chart, or are they more akin to a to-do list? You could argue they're more akin to a to-do list. The real risk, of course, are the unknown unknowns. And how do we enumerate these? Well, one way is to consult a soothsayer, but that probably is not going to work very well. How could we do it? Well, I suggest the way is to examine the history of analogous missions and enumerate the actual risks that have occurred. I mentioned those cadres earlier on in the talk, and the cadres are good sources of documentation of what really happened to real projects as they wended their way through the project life cycle. So that's a good place to look for what risks actually have occurred in projects. Furthermore, I suggest that the scatter and the CERs and SERs, schedule estimating relationships, really is sort of the cosmic background radiation. Those of you who are Kobe fans, it really is the spacecraft mission. I think it was some athlete named Kobe, but I wouldn't know about that. I suggest that the scatter and CERs and SERs is the cosmic background radiation evidence of unknown risk. That's kind of why we see scatter when we plot the cost versus, let's say, mass of a historical spacecraft. So maybe all we really have to do is construct a CER, SER prediction interval and budget cost and time to whatever percent confidence level we want. We want 50%. Let's construct a prediction interval and budget to the 50 percentile, or maybe a little bit higher to offset optimism. It's the CER and SER input variables, okay? Because that's probably still there. So that'd be kind of a real easy way to get to a confidence level without having to go through all the JCL stuff. So I want you to keep that in mind for a moment. Let's go to the next chart. Okay. Now, there's another book out there that I could it's the same author, different book, but the same author that I would recommend to you, The Failure of Risk Management by Douglas Hubbard. And he has some really well thought out criticisms of the risk register approach. So I would commend that book to you. One of his criticisms is assigned scores tend to cluster around the mid range. If you got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scale, a abnormal number of the risks seem to be kind of a 2, 3, a lot of 3s and some 4s. Very few 1s and 5s. So on a 5-point scale, 75% of all responses are 3 or 4. So that changing a score from 3 to 4 or vice versa can have a real disproportionate effect on the risk. It makes a large swing. The scores sometimes implicitly assume that the magnitude of the quantity is proportional to the scale. It's a ratio scale. Well, they're not really. I mean, a score of 2 doesn't really imply the risk is twice as large as a risk with a score of 1, but we tend to forget that and use it that way, Hubbard says. Scoring techniques presume that the factors being scored are independent of each other, no correlation, and that's a problem. And there's lots of others in his book, so if you want to read about the failure of risk management is a little bit of a horrific title, to sell books, but it hasn't failed. But as with any discipline, there's some room for improvement. I think he does a real good job in that book of pointing those out. So what does he suggest? Well, instead of risk matrices, Hubbard suggested we just do probabilistic modeling. Now we've got this wonderful tool called Monte Carlo simulation. Let's build probabilistic models of the risk events and tag how those risks actually impact things in the schedule, and establish probabilities based on historical data and empirical observation, or even, if you have to, intuition. And the historical data part of that is what I was referring to previous chart. Let's try to use the Cont'd database to predict what the risks might be and how often they occur. Okay, so let's go to the next chart. There's another analyst out there that's done a lot of work on this that I greatly admire, David Hulett. For those of you who know David or read his book, one of his books is Integrated Cost and Schedule Risk Analysis, as I have it down at the bottom there. And he advocates a risk driver method, which focuses on the really important risk in the project risk register. And to do this, it requires a pretty good understanding of what the root causes of the cost and schedule duration uncertainties are. But that's a healthy thing to understand. So at a root level of detail, the risks are pretty much independent, David argues. And the correlation can be handled structurally by the way you build a model. So that's kind of a nice little outcome where you don't have to worry about correlation matrices and estimating how two or more things might be correlated to other things. So for each risk, you have to have the probability. You have to estimate the probability the risk will occur and the range associated with the impacts if the risk does occur, which he expresses as multiplicative factors on specific cost and schedule activities that are in the IMS or analysis IMS that you're using. Okay, let's go to the next chart. Let's go. Okay, thank you. So let's gather up all these loose ends and sort of march towards a conclusion here. So some final thoughts on interpreting JCL. I got 3 charts on this. So there are some convincing arguments out there that JCL is a good thing. In the literature by Hubbard and Hulett and others who are advocating probabilistic Monte Carlo simulation in our projects to analyze our project's cost and schedule. There's some companies out there, Booz Allen, Technology, others that have built some really good models that do that. Of course, you can use the standard off-the-shelf models as well. There's a lot of support contractors, and that's using one called Reed Integration, who are very adept at calculating or doing these JCL analyses. There's a host of other NASA support contractors also that are involved in that. There are a lot of cheerleaders in NASA that are saying, give me a big J, give me a big C, give me a big L. What's that spell? JCL, of course. So, there's enthusiastic cheerleaders at the NASA Cost Analysis Division at NASA headquarters, which is a good thing. I think one of the more important things that I've observed about JCL over the past 2 or 3 years, the NASA project management community has really bought into JCL. They're actually doing it, attempting to use JCL and to do it as opposed to – they grumbled about it for a couple of years, but now they've actually started doing it, and to a large extent, most project managers think it's working and it's a pretty good thing. And I think another final and very important thing that occurs to me is NASA's made significant progress in communicating to the Hill and to the OMB that the purpose and sanctity of something called UFE. UFE is a NASA buzzword for unidentified future expenses or unallocated future expenses. It's reserve or contingency by any other name. But there's been a history within NASA when we identify reserve or UFE, whatever you want to call it, for a project. And we don't, the Hill come along or OMB will come along and say, hey, we need some money for something that's happening somewhere else, and we see you have this pot of money laying there for this project, and you don't know what you're going to use it for, so adios money, we're taking it. So NASA headquarters, Doug Comstock and others have done a good job of convincing those stakeholders that we got to hang on to the UFE. I mean, JCL does identify some unidentified future expenses, unallocated future expenses, but you can't take that. You got to wait till they get identified and the money gets allocated to them to work it off. This whole thing won't work unless that happens. Okay, chart 2 of 3 here on some final thoughts. Let's go to the next chart. JCL is considered in NASA right now as a cost estimating and schedule estimating tool. I submit it's not really that at all. It really shouldn't be thought of as a very optimum methodology for obtaining more accurate cost and schedule estimates. That's crazy to think of it that way. If that's all we're interested in doing, there are far simpler ways to get at cost and schedule, working near the top of the work breakdown structure, in my belief, but other much more streamlined ways to get to cost and schedule estimates without cranking the huge machine that JCL is. So while we're on the subject, I want to point out that because JCL is a huge machine, it has so many moving parts, all final JCL cost and schedule estimates should be checked with some kind of high-level analogy or parametric estimate prior to going to press with them. Just is this thing making sense? Are these numbers coming out of the JCL machine making sense? And if the analogy estimate and JCL estimate differ by a significant amount, then you got to reconcile that because something's probably gone wrong in the machine works. Okay, let's go to chart 3 with some final thoughts on JCL. So finally, I'd like to submit that the cost and schedule estimate that is produced by JCL is really a trivial feature of JCL. What's far more important is that JCL forces us to lay out all our work in an integrated management schedule and its stepchild, the analysis schedule that we use for JCL. It requires that we logic link all these activities and debug the schedule, good things that we didn't always used to do until JCL came along. It requires that we inform the schedule with costs and understand the time-dependent and time-independent activities and how to divide the costs into time-dependent and time-independent costs. It necessitates that we give risk and uncertainties far more thought than we've traditionally done it, at least in the planning stages. So we really have to start thinking about risk early. And but the next step is it gives us a tool to assign those risks to various project activities and specify the schedule impact and the cost impact if the risk happens. And once JCL analysis has been done, it illuminates for us the impacts of risk and provides us a tool to assess risk mitigation plans. We can say, okay, we see this risk is really hitting our project pretty heavily here. What can we do to go back and try to mitigate that and run JCL again to see if it helps? So it's important to maintain the JCL through the project life cycle because project manager will need to adjust the project plan as a consequence of dealing with risk. So it's not something you do at the start of a project, and then once the project is approved, you say, boy, I'm glad we're through with that. Let's throw this in the shoebox. You've got to keep that as JCL capability running. Okay, let's go to the next chart. Okay, so 3 more charts and we'll be done here. We'll be ready for some questions or comments or whatever. All right, so let's draw this up with some conclusions, recommendations. So I think one thing that comes to light right away if you work in the JCL world is additional research is needed on some things. One is a schedule duration database should be developed. We've been pretty good over the years about capturing historical cost data, but we've not been as good at capturing historical schedule data. So when we set down to estimate the schedule of so we're going to develop a solar array. Okay, we think that solar array is going to take 24 months to develop. Well, where do we get that 24 months? Is that based on any historical data? We really need to start collecting that data better than we do. I've mentioned several times that we have to have a cost broken into time-dependent and time-independent costs. That's really easy to say, but we haven't done that in our historical data. So when you look back at that same solar array that I alluded to a moment ago, and you see that it cost $50 million to develop, well, how much of that was time-independent and how much was time-dependent? We have no historical data on that. Almost done to make that division. So, in other words, one thing we need to do to make JCL work better is to defeat this village watchman syndrome of bad data by collecting better schedule duration data and better data on time and time-dependent and time-independent costs. Chart 2 of conclusion and recommendations. We can go to the next chart. Okay, so this is really the responsibility of those of us in the cost and schedule community, but I think the risk register methods need to be improved. As I mentioned a moment ago, a few charts back, I think a good thing would be to consider using the risk from analogous completed missions, kind of get away from that, making the risk register just a to-do job list. So another thing would be to help project managers realize that their teams probably, by and large, are approaching normal. They've probably got normal skills. Their team, there's some outstanding players on every team. The project manager, he or she may be an outstanding project manager, but there's also some that are on the other side of the capability curve for this given project. So, you deal with enough projects, most of them have a team that's of normal capability, not exceptional. And the asterisk on the chart means compared to other NASA teams. I mean, NASA teams are pretty exceptional folks, okay, but they're competing in the fishbowl on the aquarium with a lot of other exceptional folks. So on average, they're probably about normal with the people they're working with. Okay, let's go to the third of the conclusions recommendations. Okay, and this last one, the cost analysis division at NASA headquarters, I think should be tracking the results of JCL in terms of actual cost and schedule outcomes. Is this thing called JCL actually decreasing our overruns and of cost and our schedule delays? In other words, let's prove the fallacy of thinking that we're already in the best of all possible worlds and see if we can actually make a sea change to a better world, but measure that so that we know that we're actually doing it.